Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to From My Point of View. I'm Deborah Berg, the Acting Director for Education here at the museum. Today's speaker is Mindy Besaw, curator at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art and co-curator for the exhibition Painted Journeys, the Art of John Stanley. Prior to her current position, Besaw was curator of the Buffalo Bill Center of the Whitney Western Art Museum. That's a mouthful. There she spearheaded the renovation and reinstallation of galleries for its 50th anniversary. She earned her master's degree in art history from the University of Denver and is a PhD candidate in American art history at the University of Kansas. She has written and lectured on a variety of artists covering 19th and 21st century America, and recently collaborated on a partnership with the High Museum of Art in Atlanta for the exhibition and publication Art of the American Frontier, based on the Buffalo Bill Center's collections. Today's talk, of course, will focus on John Stanley, and in particular, the painting The Last of Their Race, which was produced in 1857. It played an influential role in forming, reflecting, and reinforcing attitudes toward American Indians in the 19th century. And I want to remind you that following the talk, we will have a signing in the museum store of the exhibition catalog. Some of you have already asked me about it, so I wanted you to know this is what it looks like. There'll be a table set up outside the store, and you can have a chat with Mindy, and you can look through the book. So help me welcome Mindy Besaw.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming on Friday afternoon. I'm not sure remember which day it is. So what I'm going to do today is, this is from my perspective, and in fact that's one of the things we will really look at in detail with this painting. Now, of course, I would commend to you to go see the painting in person, just right over there after the show. I know some of you have seen it before this. So what my talk will do is we're going to look at details, and it's kind of a dark painting, and I know it's bright in here, but again, you can see the painting in person, so I'm not terribly worried about the reproductions. So we'll look closely, kind of walk through the painting, and what I want to do is talk about 19th century perception, my point of view today, and just kind of get you in that framework of thinking of this. And the concept or ideology that we will be focusing on is the idea of the so-called doomed Indian. So I know that kind of seems like an intense title, but it is. So because some of you may not know as much about John Stanley as others, if you haven't had a chance to go to the exhibition, I'll give a little brief introduction to Stanley before I get to the painting in more detail. I'm going to put my phone here so that I'm not going way over on time. And I would encourage you, like, if you have some questions partway through, just stop me. We can make this casual. So you might just say, "Excuse me, Mindy," and we'll go from there. So John Stanley's life might best be understood as a series of journeys, hence the title to the exhibition, Painted Journeys. And so some of these are physical journeys that he took literally as an itinerant portrait painter in the old Northwest, in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois, other cities in the Northeast. It might also be his travels throughout the West. So he took many artistic journeys looking for subjects, looking for adventure, all part of that. And then those experiences make it into his artwork. And so this is just a map that we devised in Cody to give a sense of some of the places that he traveled to. You might also think of the variety of his oeuvre, of his career, as a series of journeys. So as I mentioned, one thing that he did do was, as an itinerant portrait painter, went around and painted portraits. So finding those clients and painting portraits of prominent families, also helped fund some of his journeys. So this is pre-transcontinental railroad. It was not inexpensive to get all the way to Hawaii, for example. And so painting portraits of families or figures on the way would have helped with his finances as well. We also might think of him as an expedition illustrator. So he was hired as an artist out of Santa Fe to accompany the Kearney and Emory expedition through the Southwest in 1846. He was hired as an artist on the Northern Railroad route with Isaac Stevens in 1853. So those would have been employed jobs, but as he was going, he was able to gather material for his own work along the way. We might also, I might also mention that he was an entrepreneur, and one of his journeys was sending around something that he had illustrated called, it was a panorama, and this is just a little illustration. This would have been quite tall, so if I was standing next to it, I might stand about here to give you a sense of the scale. There's no figures in that to give you an idea of it, but something bigger than this screen. That would have been for entertainment. So you would pay, and this is pre-movies, and so it was called Stanley's Western Wilds, and they were these vignettes and a story that would go along with it. So think of his Western Wilds as another journey that Stanley had gone on. And the buffalo was one painting, an easel-sized painting that was part of the vignettes that he had painted for this panorama. We might also think of a journey as his compilation of his Indian gallery, and that was over 150 paintings of American Indians that he had met, or genre scenes, other scenes that he had painted, compiling them together and taking those paintings literally on a journey as they would travel around. You would pay admission like a special exhibition and go to see that. So that was another journey. Those works ending up in the Smithsonian on loan as he was advocating to the government to purchase those works. And in 1865, the fire that then destroyed more than 150 paintings, 7 of them did survive. And so another kind of journey of Stanley's, what to do after the bulk of your life's work has literally gone up in flames. So another series of a journey. Today, if Stanley is known, and hopefully through this exhibition and publication, it's often through his paintings of American Indians. 2 examples, one from the cover of the book, in fact. He tended to paint scenes that were not terribly violent, although it's hard to make a lot of blanket statements about Stanley because this painting is not in the exhibition, an Osage scalp dance, but he's very rich in depth and variety. So you might have these more kind of familiar images of Stanley's, which is like the Native American grouping here, stopping to smoke, and that cultural kind of behavior of, think of men in Victorian era, also, gathering together for a smoke, so how that relates culturally. So these kinds of images, but it was certainly not the only thing that he painted. So that was a very quick introduction to Stanley, and again, I would commend the exhibition to you if you want a little more in-depth look at John McStanley's work, because today I am going to focus on The Last of Their Race. The Last of Their Race is a painting that's in the collection of the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, where I was a curator, and so I had a great opportunity to study this in more depth and think about it in more depth, and that it becomes also the basis for my essay in the catalog. There are lots of ways that we could approach one single painting and the study of that painting. It was done in 1857, So if I were to look in depth at this, I might think of how this painting is an exemplary example of Stanley's work, especially from the 1850s. If you were on my tour this morning, I had kind of said the 1850s was really when Stanley hit his mark. It was when his technique improved. He was in Washington, D.C., studying with other artists. And so, you know, his technique is much finer than it was in his early career. I might also talk to you about how this painting through exhibitions was part of his success. He was gaining recognition as a painter in America through this work. He painted more than one version of this scene, the Buffalo Bill Center of the West version on the upper left. The other version is in the Stark Museum of Art's collection in Orange, Texas. I might also tell you a little bit about the Provenance. The painting in the Buffalo Bill Center of the West collection we think was in the collection of Isaac Stevens. So Isaac Stevens was the expedition leader in 1853 on the railroad survey. So that's pretty interesting, you know, that this painting went into that collection. And I'll talk a little bit more about the background of the painting on the right as well, but that one was in the collection of Major Alexander Culbertson, a trader on the upper Missouri River and founder of Fort Benton. There's a great portrait of Culbertson in the exhibition. Oh, and I illustrated it. I was getting ahead of myself. I might also tell you, if I was looking at this painting in more depth, of the collection that's now in the National Museum of the American Indian, which has some of the objects that Stanley had collected in his lifetime. They were donated later. And this shirt is in that collection, so the shirt that was likely used for inspiration for that central figure. So what I could do with this painting is tell you, just break down all those little details, right? We could go into his biography, we could go into who the people are, which I will do to a point. But I want to use this painting instead to talk about cultural perception, about how these things may have been viewed, about how we might still view them today. So I guess, what's the name of this? Like, this is in my opinion, or, you know, my perspective, right? So it's all that other stuff is relevant. And if we go back, and one of the things I will use today to give you a sense of cultural perception is literary sources, poetry sources from the time period. So we'll just start with one from Washington Irving, who wrote this in 1814. They will vanish like a vapor from the face of the earth. The places that now know them will know them no more forever. Quite the prediction in 1814. So this idea, this doomed Indian or vanishing race, kind of used interchangeably, was the nation's unquestioning faith that America's native tribes were doomed to disappear in the face of progress. That both of those things could not exist side by side. If you had progress, if you had Western expansion, by its very nature, you could no longer have American Indians as they were. So this is an ideology, a cultural ideology. It's not just a romantic notion that's going to inspire artists like Stanley, or poets, or writers, or literature. It is something that comes to define how the government makes laws, how they move forward. So embedded in that. So I want to talk about that in more depth. Also, if you're interested in this topic, I would commend to you a book by Brian Dippy, if you don't know it, The Vanishing American, which talks about this in more depth and was really helpful to me in my thinking. So, perception, point of view. Stanley's position, and this is Stanley's self-portrait, I believe really was one of sympathy, of genuine interest in the native peoples that he met throughout his journey. But even in his sympathy for American Indians, I do also believe that he was influenced by this idea of the doomed Indian. So no matter how much your personal belief might contribute to your art, I do think you're really affected by cultural beliefs and cultural attitudes. So that's kind of the take that I approach this painting with. Stanley was very much a man of his time. He was living in the nation's capital for many years, painted all these other thinkers and important people, so he was very much part of that cultural influence. And his art, in turn, it was painted at a certain time, but it's still influencing us today. And I'm going to get to some other images from the early 20th century that you'll probably recognize and go, oh yeah, okay, I see this, and it still influences us. One of my beliefs as an art historian is that our visual arts, visual images, have a very strong role in affecting how we think of the world. I believe in the power of art. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in this business because it doesn't pay a lot. That power of art is what keeps me going. So I like to think of these images as influencers, as reflectors of their culture and as a lasting influence. Now, we'll also just get right down to it. I also have a perspective on this painting, on Stanley. I am an American woman of European descent. I'm an American art historian. I've been studying art history for a long time, and I'm still in school. So this is my interest, this is my passion. I live in the 21st century. I'm a part, all of that influences my perception. You all have your own backgrounds, life experiences, heritage. But one thing I think we can collectively at least agree on is that we're all here at the Gilcrease today in 2015. So we'll start with that. That is one collective perception that we have of this painting. And I told you some of my other conditions and how I'm looking at it. So what I would like to try and do is take you a little bit out of 2015 and back to the 19th century. And how I'm going to do that, to start, is with a poem. And this was written when this painting was shown in 1857 at the Washington Art Association. A newspaper printed a poem by L.A. Christie, and the poem was printed alongside the painting and described the doomed race idea. So this is a good measure, I think, of public interpretation through the newspaper of this painting. So, in movie sequences, we would have like the fuzzy, So I'm going to take you back to the 19th century. Is everyone ready? And here we rest to die, away our distant grounds where once our chieftains stood. The white man's sharp-edged axe has fallen the sheltering wood. The white man's thundering gun has scared our game away, and we have wanderers been o'er many a weary day. We give to him our lands, and with our ready bow we farther westward found abundant game to chase in a vast hunting ground. But he grew strong and brave, of lands he wanted more, and soon he brought his plow close to our wigwam door. But this is our last stand, and from this narrow rock washed by the restless sea, our love, lost hunting grounds, we bid farewell to these. No more we'll draw the bow, for bleached skulls round us lie, our game starved on this shore, and here we'll bravely die. Great Spirit, unto thee, thy children turn their face in their last agony. Into thy lodge so cast, oh, let me quickly come. And though thy forests wide in freedom over roam, where we shall meet again, our warriors in their home. So the first time that this painting is shown, that's the interpretation. That's what's paired with it. I think the poem was probably written earlier, but the fact that someone matched these up, I think, speaks volumes as to the perception of this. So it's no wonder that the poem paired with this would again kind of get us into that cultural interpretation of the doomed Indian. Because by this time, so this is 1857 again, Stanley on his many journeys, he starts his journeys in the 1840s, comes through very close to here, and into the 1850s. So he's experiencing this dramatic change in life for Native American peoples. This is after President Andrew Jackson's 1830 Removal Act, really takes nearly 50,000 Native peoples from their homes into Indian territory. So Stanley would have seen this, witnessed it firsthand. So I think that's another thing to remember. Manifest destiny, this attitude of our just God-given right to expand across the continent, is another ideology that's guiding policies, guiding American thinking at the time. So a term that started in 1845 describing this belief in the divine obligation to stretch all the way to the Pacific Ocean in the painting. But also at the heart of Manifest Destiny is this idea of cultural and racial superiority. So it is just a side effect. It was just a matter of fact. The Euro-Americans were going to expand, and because of that, a so-called inferior race was not going to be there anymore. So you see how if this was something that was all around you, even if you thought, oh my gosh, this is not good, this is not a good thing, you would still be shaped by these ideologies that come to you. In 1828, Oliver Smith told the House of Representatives, this is a congressman, "We have seen them driven by whites from river to river, from state to state, from hill to hill, from mountain to mountain, and from forest to forest. The tide of white emigration still flowing west and still pressing close upon them. And if we continue the present policy, the time cannot be very far distant when the last sound of the Indian must die in the Pacific." 1828. So, again, just context. So, I want to look now, you're going to see this image, you're going to see the last of their Indian, and we're going to look at details throughout and use that as just markers to think about different issues. So first, a close-up of the central figures here. It's a multi-generational group, so you see elders as well as down to the baby in the cradle, so many generations pictured together. They read as a group because they overlap. So Stanley in his composition has overlapped these figures. They're in that triangle pose or the triangle composition, a very sturdy composition. So they have all of that there. But if you look closely at them looking at each other or toward each other, their gazes don't meet. This man's looking down. I'm not sure where he's looking. I think it's meant to look up. He's kind of looking off into a distance. She draws our attention to the top here. Okay, there's some eye contact there. We're not sure where this figure is looking. So they read as a group together, but they don't meet in their gaze. And is anyone looking at us? No. So they're all looking in a different direction or toward one another, but they're not meeting our gaze. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit closer. John Berger had a very influential book, an art critic, called Ways of Seeing. And in that book, he presented this idea of an active viewer and a passive subject. His passive subject was typically a female that was looking away, which gave the agency to the viewer, which tended to be understood as male. So this is Barbara Kruger, a more recent 1981 image, but your gaze hits the side of my face. So it's the female looking away, and what that text there is just kind of giving that a more violent side to it. Your gaze hits the side of my face, so where's the power? It's in the viewer. If we extend that to Stanley's painting, the agency, the power has been given to the viewer. There's no one meeting our gaze to challenge us here. They're all kind of looking away as just passive subjects. And that would be for the white viewer to look at the native subject and kind of take agency over that. So that's also playing into this allegorical message. Now the elders, or the one elder. So different parts of the painting. Also, again, not looking at us. And this time I'm going to look more closely at their the clothing, the objects that they're wearing. So from colonial times, Euro-Americans spoke of native tribes as if it was one. Not recognizing a lot of the individual characteristics from one tribe to the next. It became a collective tribe or people or race in one together. Of course, we know today we're a little more sensitive to this, especially in Oklahoma. How many tribes are in Oklahoma? Over 100? So a lot. And there's a little more notion. But if you think of this, Stanley's giving us a kind of collective symbol. And I pull up these figures here because of the roach headdress worn with the feathers worn by that standing man here. Very similar to the headdresses that Stanley paints in the Osage scalp dance. And for an American audience in the early 19th century and mid-19th century, this would also reference another kind of historical, now literary narrative of the last of the Mohicans. So being more associated with those eastern tribes. This is Thomas Cole's Last of the Mohicans from 1827, painted shortly after James Fenimore Cooper published The Last of the Mohicans. So the last of the Mohicans, what does that story seem to say literarily for the early 19th century? The last of, they're going away, in this case, the Mohicans. So this was inspiring for artists, inspired another outpouring of literature, and Thomas Cole is just one example. So this is immediately after the publication, kind of a literary tale of what was then even in America's past and the history. Another example, Asher B. Durand. This painting is actually now in the collection of the White House. How about that for a national collection, a national message for the nation? Painted, if you'll notice the date, 1857, same year that Stanley's Last of Their Race was painted. At one time, this painting held the title of The Last of the Mohicans as well, so a popular, again, literary trope that repeats for us. Showing, too, that continuation of the popularity of that subject of The Last of the Mohicans. Asher B. Durand is, if not by this time, somewhere around here. He's the president of the National Academy of Design. He came right after Thomas Cole, important for the history of American art in the Hudson River School and that background. So Asher B. Durand, for this painting, was asked by the American Art Union to paint a landscape. And he painted his landscape, but then importantly added a figure. Not, a figure who's just out hiking, a poet, whatever. Importantly, it's a Native American figure, also with a headdress that might give us the sense of an Eastern tribe or the Last of the Mohicans, again, because it was so popular. And Durand is incorporating this partially as a reference to America's pure past. So Durand, other Hudson River School painters are thinking about wilderness, and especially the wildness of wilderness and nature, as the defining characteristics of America. That's our history, that's our past. We don't have the classical ruins that Italy has, but in America it was landscape. So the past. By putting the figure in here, the Native American figure, it also referenced America's past, the natural. So it was a symbol. It wasn't, someone that he had seen. It was symbolic. So, okay, well, if this was just painted for one client, that would be one thing. It was painted for the American Art Union, which means it was disseminated across the country to anyone who was subscribing to the American Art Union. So it was a subject that had much wider implications. So we can't underestimate the impact of something like this, the figure in nature. Oh, and one more. Is the sun rising or setting? Any guesses? I'd go for the sunset, right? The sun setting on an era, setting on the past. So we'll come back to that sunset here in a minute. But now back to Stanley, the young chief Uncas. So what was the name of the last of the Mohican? Do you all know Cooper's book well enough to know? Uncas? It was Uncas, yeah. So Uncas is the last of the Mohican. But let's look at this image for a little bit. What accoutrements are telling us that this is a Mohican? Not much. You know, the head wrap, the feathers are kind of interesting, but the buckskins, the necklaces, all of this is much more associated with Plains tribes. And then again, if you know Cooper's story, how about this age? In the story, he's a grown man, and here is this young boy. So it's very symbolic. You know, the fact that he's, and I know this says Young Chief. There were 2 paintings done of this, and Stanley called one of them the Young Chief Uncas. So it was published as the Young Chief Uncas. So the Young Chief. So it's a little different, and again, it's symbolic, and it goes back to this association of kind of all Indians being one. The Plains Indian imagery tended to then stand for a much wider, more symbolic Indian. And if you think of, or if you know the text of Cooper's book, Uncas's father laments this demise of his tribe and says, and this is right from Cooper, "Where are the blossoms of those summers, fallen one by one? So all of my family departed, each in his turn to the land of spirits. I am on the hilltop and must go down into the valley, and when Uncas follows in my footsteps, there will no longer be any of the blood of the Sagamores, for my boy is the last of the Mohicans." So this pose on the precipice, up on the rock, looking down, you know, kind of looking forward to that. The stormy sky may also be a bit of impending doom. Now, interestingly, and this is a little bit of an aside, but I think it goes with our perception if we're back in the 19th century, critical reviews of The Last of the Mohicans, which was still a popular book into the 1880s, critics were kind of saying, you know, the portrayal of Uncas is unbelievable. It's not really realistic. And they were criticizing it because they thought that it brought too much of a personal element to the character. So if culturally we're supposed to think of American Indians as simple, really incapable of complex feelings, Cooper gives him complex feelings, is a character that we identify with. So this Last of the Mohicans kind of started to be associated with people who seemed to have like this unnatural sympathy for American Indians. It was used in that rhetoric. So another, I think, just kind of interesting how our interpretation of these things change. They became a code for Easterners who were too sentimental, too sympathetic. So that's one character now. Any questions, comments till now?
Question.
Yeah, Jim.
So John Stanley, with all his travels through Indian country, obviously knew the diversity and the differences between the tribes,
Yep.
but in this particular painting, there is nothing, being familiar with Northwest Coast Indians, there's nothing that they're wearing that has anything to do with Northwest Coast Indians.
Right.
Like you said, it's all either Northern Plains or Plateau, kind of bits and pieces of different tribes. But he was also a documentarian. He would document, the journeys and hopefully try to be accurate about that. So it's totally contrived. I get that, but I just think, wouldn't it be against the grain from his training to do that? To just take a conglomeration of an Indian from here, an Indian from there, slap them on the Pacific coast, and for that particular image without referencing the tribes that were there.
Yes. So Stanley, as opposed to Catlin. So I would put Stanley and Catlin side by side and say, Catlin always said, I am a documentarian. I'm going to get people to sign the back of my canvases and say, this is accurate. This is what I really looked like. This was it. Stanley is a bit more allegorical, fine art training, a bit more romantic, and he's going to use his actual experience as somewhat of marketing, right? Like, I was there, I know this. But because of the audiences with this particular painting, and I think he had lots of different motivations for making different paintings. In his Indian gallery, his motivation is probably a bit more documentarian because he's actually publishing something that says, this is so-and-so, this is his biography, this is what he did. With this one, it's very different. Now, what we'll also get to with this is, who was it painted for? If this was for Isaac Stevens, Stevens knew the variety of people out there too. Fascinating. The two men would have known there's a lot more to it than just this. So that's an interesting characteristic. And then we'll get to another central figure who's married to Culbertson as well, which would also suppose you would know. So initially when I wrote this essay, I tried to say that most of the things in here were Blackfeet because a lot of his objects came from there and they seem to relate to that northern Montana area. And when this was peer reviewed, everyone disagreed with me because I was trying to pull it back together and say he knew the difference here and this is what he was doing.
You have the Central Plains roach, like with the Osages, and so it's just, it's totally contrived. It seems for a person who was making a living as a documentarian, and then to totally, in a way, commercialize this to play to the romanticized ideals of
and the larger perception that all Indians sort of looked like Plains Indians. They were the most romantic, they were the most picturesque, and Catlin contributed to that, right? So all of these kind of things are coming together. And so I think that is part of it, was that he had different audiences, and so it was more complex than documentary. Do I have another question?
Well, I guess a comment that, back to the last of your race, it's almost the generic Indian that is a metaphor for all of those that have been pushed to the edge of the continent and are now about to tumble into the Pacific.
Right.
They vanish. So.
Yeah. Yeah, and then there are other messages in this. You guys still with me? Should I keep talking?
But the reality was, this is after Indians, the Removal Act. So Indians weren't being pushed to the Pacific Ocean; they were being rounded up and put in the central part of the United States.
I know, yeah. There's some perceptions and realities that are very different. Yeah. Absolutely. But for people who lived in the East and just didn't get it, they also didn't really maybe have that same sense.
Well, yeah, because you got Salish and others that were taken from the West and brought to the East, brought east. And
lots of movement.
Right here, yeah.
So what about the pediment sculpture on the U.S. Capitol? So here's another place. Just going to show you a few other artists that have some similar messages happening. So in the 1850s, 1850, Congress legislated for the expansion of the U.S. Capitol. And this particular pediment, which is above the east entrance to the Senate wing, and this was the stated goal or subject of this sculpture. the struggle between civilized man and the savage, between the cultivated and wild nature. So the Capitol building. And just to give you a sense closer, so we have America here in the center, and this side is going to be the sort of frontier past of America. This is looking forward. So America, this is America, her right hand, her left. On this side, we have little boys going to school, learning. That's the future of children here. On the other side, so cutting down the tree, remember that lament for the wildness and the wilderness of America. And then next to it, here you have an Indian boy. We'll get up close. The chief, we're meant to interpret this as, and then the mother with the baby, and she lays next to a grave. So by introducing a family unit, this is also important, the multi-generations. It's not just the death of the leader, the one single male. It's for the women, the children, all of the next generations. So it made it even more poignant that there was the end or the death. You know, compared to William Ranney, Advice on the Prairie, who gets the future of the West? Right there. You know, the Renaissance mother and baby. This is where all the future promise goes. And in comparison, this is what's happening to the tribes. Again, a message. You know, a message right underneath. And no mistake that there's an Indian eagle feather headdress here as a symbol.
What's even worse is at Union Station in Washington, D.C., you've got Columbus conquering America with the natives cowering at the feet of Columbus. Yeah. And those are the two symbols before the National Museum of the American Indian that represent Indian culture in our nation's capital.
Yep. So this is 19th century, mid-19th century when this is being done. And as a comparison, right on the same pediment, this is what happens to Native children, and this is what happens to white children. They are educated, they are our future, this is our past. So this dichotomy, that one is more sort of rich and interpretive with the other as a comparison. Another art union print. Everywhere, this went everywhere. Again, another family, this is a different artist. Tompkins Madison, The Last of Their Race, same title, 1847, so a decade earlier. This print would have widely circulated throughout the country. And things were chosen for the art union if they were legible subjects, if they were appealing to a wide variety of people, and so you have that there. It was reproduced in the Odd Fellows offering, so this is like a Masons group. Stanley painted portraits of the Odd Fellows. Those were some of his clients on his itinerant portrait painting groups. It is highly possible that he knew of this image by Madison, which was a decade earlier. So this may be also where he's getting some of his inspiration from, these widely produced images. Stanley certainly wasn't the first to think about this and quite literally push them, up to the edge of the water. Now this figure, the specificity of all of this. Stanley knew this woman, he had met her. Her name is Natalie Stowe. She is the wife of Major Alexander Culbertson. So Culbertson was the founder of Fort Benton, and Natalie Stowe was his partner. They were a very influential couple. She's a Blackfeet Indian from the Blood tribe, and again, married to Major Culbertson. She too is passive in this image because we are looking at her. She's not meeting our gaze, which is completely different than any description of who she was as a person. She was just a force. People were so impressed by her, they called her stunning. Now this is important too. this was very different from the commonly held perceptions of especially American Indian women. The American Indians that were described in the most complimentary phrases were the men, as noble, as classical, as ideal. That was common for a warrior, a noble, but it was less common to describe females, women in this way. So she was quite a remarkable person, really, and maybe it's no surprise that Stanley was really taken with her. And here is a photograph of her with one of their children. They had, I think, 5. And here's Major Culbertson. And people would describe going to the fort, and she was decked out in jewels, and she was a really nice host, and lots of really wonderful descriptors of them. John James Audubon went to Fort Benton and painted Culbertson and Nottawista, for example. They then eventually moved to Peoria, Illinois, where, as I mentioned, the last of their race was in their collection. And now here's kind of something interesting. Is it, in this case, a bit of a family portrait? I don't know. Is it all about where it's being displayed? Oh, I'm going to skip that. I'm running out of time on all of you. But I wanted to mention that this one, seen from afar, was Nottawista's brother. And so he was a recognizable person within the tribe. And so if Culbertson and Nottawista owned this painting, would it have been considered more familiar, more of a family portrait? And would some of the clothing and other parts of the portrait have been theirs? So here we have more of that tension of audiences, of a variety of audiences, and how it's being conveyed. Did Stanley paint it as a family portrait? I don't think so. I think he had a broader sense in mind. Did Culbertson and Nottawista see the first version and say, oh my gosh, we must have one of those? Potentially. It goes with the provenance. So that's pretty interesting. I also would compare the two of them. So this is the figure from The Pediment by Thomas Crawford, and then Stanley's figure, who has much more agency, is standing strong rather than slumped over. So there is further that tension in Stanley of, is there some insight and sympathy comparatively to something that was much more symbolic or iconic? Yeah, I would argue in my perspective, there is a difference with this. And some of it's all about comparison. And it's certainly not this dying Tecumseh, the really defeated, lying down figure. And you might say, well, why would you even compare that? Well, 1856, same time period. This is artistic movement. Stanley is part of these artistic circles. Would also relate classically. Again, this goes back to imbuing the male figure with nobility and qualities of classical standards, back to classical Greek and Roman art, like the Dying Gaul. The Dying Gaul, the Gauls were an enemy, but the Gaul, he is muscular, strong. So if you've defeated this other person, makes you even stronger, right, symbolically, which is part of that connection then to the other dying figure. And just so happens, this is one of those exciting nerdy art historical discoveries. This is a photograph of Stanley's Indian gallery. What's that? The Dying Gaul. It was really common to have plaster casts of classical sculptures on view because they were over still in Italy usually and other places. And so plaster casts would be there for study, especially for students, art history students or art students in general. And what an interesting comparison that the Dying Gaul was within this Indian gallery. Seemingly otherwise out of place, but conceptually, actually maybe not. So, let's see. I have about 11 minutes till 1, but I want to leave time for questions. So I'm just going to breeze you through Stanley not being the only person who made these allegorical, symbolic depictions of the last of. And arguably, I think they still influence visitors today. So Albert Bierschat's Last of the Buffalo, for a Cody audience, we'd be familiar with this. This is in the Buffalo Bill Center of the West collection. Henry Farney's End of the Race from 1881. Edward Curtis, Vanishing, so again, titling in very specific ways, Vanishing Race. Charles Carey Rumsey, you might not know this one as much, but this is a monumental sculpture. It used to be outside the Brooklyn Museum. I think it's been moved. Or James Earl Frazier's End of the Trail. Now Frazier, after he shows his monumental version at the San Francisco Exposition in 1915, he proposes an actual monumental 15-foot tall version of this perched at the edge of the Pacific Ocean. So this is many years after Stanley. Very different cultural implications after the turn of the 20th century, after the Indian Wars, after all of that. Very different motivations, but similar message still happening. The setting sun. You'll often see that symbolism as the setting sun on the past. It's not usually a good sign, right? With the setting sun, with the bison skulls. And there we have it, all around. Yeah.
Your paintings, this one and also the young chief, the figures seem to be looking back behind the viewer somewhat, so giving the appearance they're looking at the past. How would you compare that outlook, as you described it in detail, to the new monument, the Crazy Horse monument being constructed and sculpted
in South
Dakota, in which he is mounted on a running horse and he has
moving forward.
Pardon me?
Moving forward,
yes, and
right?
saying, these are the lands of my people wherever they are buried.
Yeah, and this is part of artist's license. There are so many things that we subtly are getting in compositions and how people are posed that we might not, see it or internalize it right away. We might say, oh, well, okay, we have a multi-generational group of figures. But these little things like looking behind or being framed in certain ways versus being given agency, moving forward, they have an impact on how we read the subject. And so, I think there's so many different cultural contexts to the Crazy Horse Monument versus this one. And really, I don't know enough about the Crazy Horse Monument except for I have visited. But I know there's lots of debates around that too. So that could be another kind of interesting slice in time. And to see, also not being made by a native person or not designed by. But I'm going to let people who know more about that get right to the details. Other questions? Conversation? You can come back to 2015.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The female that you mentioned.
Natalie?
Her facial expression looks as if she's not happy with what's going on.
Right. You could read that into it.
Yeah.
By 1857, the Culbertsons, actually, this is part of what happens to them over time. Very successful in Fort Benton. 1850s, there's a lot of legislation going on, especially related to Blackfeet relations in Montana. Now I'm close to Missouri, it comes out. In Montana, in Washington, D.C. So Culbertson and likely Nottoway to actually go to Washington, D.C. to be part of these talks and negotiations. But not very long after that, by especially 1860, they moved to Peoria. So they're not doing the trading anymore. They're in Peoria. And eventually, Culbertson goes bankrupt. And so the painting sells. So he doesn't even keep his version of The Last of Their Race for his whole life. And she goes back and lives on a reservation with her family. So she leaves, they separate. In some ways, if we want to read more symbolically into it, it's that what happens to that painting and how it leaves that family is almost as if it's a prediction, right, in this allegorical painting. And, there's also something that happens with Euro-Americans or U.S., legislators at the time where they we get to a point and go, oh no, look what's happened. Well, the doomed Indian idea also removes any responsibility, right? It was just something that happened. There was nothing we could have done about it. It's powerful, these ideologies. And then to have to stumble backwards on this and say, oh my gosh, what, So it's very interesting. And then even not always done, yeah. So, how about that for uplifting?
I'm always fascinated by the visual appearance of some of the clothing
Sure.
on the American Indian, not only here at the Gilcrease, but even in this picture. It's always very classically tasteful. Was that just for the viewer, or how could you explain that to me? It's always so pretty.
It's always so pretty. Well, again, Stanley was collecting objects, and so I think he was basing some of how these things looked on the actual objects that he did have. It goes back to the documentary part of it. But absolutely, it's beautiful. He's selling paintings as well.
Oh, it's for the viewer.
It's for the viewer, but I do think there is some actual experience here as well. It's not simply just created. And then, gosh, with other paintings here at the Gilcrease, you'd have to look case by case and see, again, what those motivations are. I think if anything, if we could just think critically about images that we look at and not just simply accept them as, oh, well, they had to be pushed to the Pacific. If we could kind of go, wait a minute, what's going on here? And I would suggest that with everything in Stanley's exhibition, with things in the collection, who was the artist, what was their perception, what was their point of view, who was the audience at that time, how do we look at it today? And I suppose for me, it's just reintroducing that critical edge and being really careful about even things that we read. For example, this is something that happened recently. I have a 9-year-old daughter, and we love the Little House on the Prairie books. So, they're just good stories, right? Laura Ingalls Wilder, her home is not very far from here. Where she wrote the books is in Missouri. But, listen to this sentence. This is her and her father. This is the voice of the father. All they do is roam around like wild animals. Treaties or no treaties, that land belongs to folks that'll farm it. That's only common sense and justice. So the daughter thinks she did not know why the government made treaties with Indians. The only good Indian was a dead Indian. 1935. This is something that, we read that and went, okay, Lila, we have to talk to you about something. Because it's just here. It's just in our culture. It's still part of our culture. And if we can be more critical and more aware of it, I just think that will go so far. So,
you were speaking about how people thought it was just inevitable. We still actually say that today because we say, it probably wouldn't have mattered which nations colonized us and which Europeans came here. It was all going to turn out the same way anyway.
Yeah, and we just say those things, and do we really mean it? Where is that coming from? So, yeah, and again, I have my very particular perspective on this. I'm I am not Native, but if I can figure out where some of these things are coming from, like I just feel like that can make such a difference. So, yeah.
If you haven't read Blood and Thunder,
What is it?
Blood and Thunder, about Kit Carson's expeditions across our country and what he did with and for the Indians, it was not always inevitable.
Right.
It was very planned by our government. And when the repeating rifle came out, they were doomed.
Yeah, no, I think it was planned, but the ideology helped justify the plans. Do you see what I
The
mean?
government wanted to get rid of all the buffaloes and
Yeah.
send the rifles out to make sure they were dead. The Indian had no food, they had no clothing, they had no home, because that came from the buffalo hunts. And another thing with the picture of the Native American woman described in that book, she was the one that took care of the buffalo after it was killed. So she smelled like you can imagine. And she had the parasites from the animals living on her. So you can imagine that an artist might not want to paint her.
Right, the perception. An interesting side fact, Stanley knew and had met Kit Carson. He helped guide part of that Santa Fe expedition. So there was contact between the two of them.
And it also talks about the way the Indians in other places were moved around, not just to Oklahoma.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
the Navajos were moved out of their country and their beloved peach trees all cut and destroyed.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting book.
Good, okay. I will commend that to my reading list. Any other questions? No? Okay, well, enjoy those Stanley paintings, please.